This film is part of a series in which experts talk about the core concepts in educational assessment and tackle some tricky issues. I'm Professor Joanne Baird from the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment. Assessments can have high stakes for the people who take the tests, for their teachers, and for schools. They're used to select people for prestigious university courses, for jobs, as part of immigration procedures, and so on. The point of using assessments is to select on the basis of merit rather than nepotism or cronyism. The idea is to make society better and fairer as people receive opportunities based on meritocracy. This video focuses on the issue of fairness in assessment. We'll explore how fairness is viewed and investigated, and indeed question whether the use of assessment results in meritocracy. We begin by hearing from Professor Mary Richardson from University College London's Institute of Education on whether she believes assessment in the UK is fair.
There's a lot of debate about the fairness of national qualifications in this country. Now, again, this comes down to public understanding. In terms of technically, generally, how they work, how they perform, how they're constructed, what you're testing, what you're judging, and the outcomes you get, they're about as fair as we can make them. Because otherwise someone would have come up with something completely different by now. Think about it, obviously, because originally my interest in assessment came from working in an examination board. So it came from getting a really good grounding and understanding of the technical nature of what makes something fair, what we're looking for when we're designing an assessment, and then how that will work. And that type of fairness is incredibly important, I think, obviously, in the construction of a test or an assessment of any kind, because you need to know that it's done what you want it to do. As Gordon Stobart says, is it fit for purpose? Are we getting what it says on the tin? But I think there's a much more difficult aspect of fairness that I think is much more important, and that is to do with the nature of candidates, the equality of opportunity, and then not simply equality of opportunity, but the genuine nature of equity, understanding what equity is for people, what it means, and how we actually manage that to ensure fairness. We just cannot say that assessment systems are fair simply because they work really well technically. They have to be fair from the get-go. I think one of the really good examples of this at the moment that I'm writing about and struggling to understand is the big push in this country at the moment to try and close what they call the awarding gap in universities between students, particularly of ethnic minority backgrounds, and their peers in terms of achievement.
So we heard from Professor Richardson that it's not just the technical qualities of assessments that make them fair. She talked about fairness in more than one way. In a book called Is Assessment Fair?, Isabel Nisbet and Stuart Shaw outlined 4 senses of fairness. They said that there was 1, a formal sense, where fairness is about the accuracy of or appropriate application of a rule or design. 2, an implied contractual sense in which something is fair if it meets the legitimate expectations of those affected. 3, a relational sense in which relevantly like cases are treated alike. And 4, a retributive sense in which an outcome is regarded as fair if it is an appropriate reward or penalty for what has gone before. There are many definitions of fairness, and what is fair in the mind of one person may be unfair in the eyes of another. The Black Lives Matters campaign was a catalyst for people thinking more broadly about decolonising assessment, and there are wide concerns about inclusion more generally. Essentially, there's a groundswell of opinion questioning the use of assessments as a standardised instrument which is the same for everyone. In a retributive sense, people are asking whether the assessments should be designed differently to bring about more socially just systems. Let's hear from Professor Jennifer Randall Professor of Psychometrics and Test Development and President of the Center for Measurement Justice at the University of Michigan. Professor Randall has been analysing assessment processes in the United States with an anti-racist lens. First, she addresses the question of whether she thinks educational assessments are fair, and then she discusses how subjects are represented through assessment using the example of the discipline of history.
Yes. So are educational assessments fair in all in society? I think my answer is categorically no, to be clear. And I think if you agree with philosophers like John Rawls and Charles Mills, who articulated that this notion of fairness as justice, then you would also say that the answer is no. I think when we're talking about assessment fairness or assessment justice, we have to really be thinking about what do our design processes look like? What do we need to be considering in that process? And I think right now, what we have failed to do as a field, as the field of educational assessment, as the field of educational measurement, is really acknowledge those historical structures of oppression, like racism and sexism and colonialism, and how they're still deeply embedded within our current assessment processes and structures. We have failed to really think about how these oppressive systems are continuously having these ongoing consequences for marginalized populations, the populations for whom assessments tend not to be fair. And we haven't done anything to disrupt any of those negative outcomes or processes. Instead, what I think we've done with assessment across the world, not just in the US context, but certainly across the world, is that we've moved into it with this kind of greater good idea. This idea that if the majority find assessments fair or experience assessments as fair, then we've done what we're supposed to do. The problem with that is the majority is usually not even the majority. The majority is those who share Eurocentric values. The majority are those who possess and are privileged by whiteness. And so we've built assessments to be fair for those groups. And to whatever extent we can modify that assessment a little bit so that it might be a little more fair for someone else, we're willing to do that. But we really haven't thought about what it would look like for an assessment system to be fair for all marginalized populations, however they're marginalized. I tend to think about people who are racially and ethnically marginalized, but of course there's some other groups of people who are marginalized and experience what can only be described as an unfair assessment system. Well, I think history is interesting because it's the way we represent minoritized persons. And I will speak specifically in the US, but I certainly have a reason to believe in places like any place that has been colonized or has been the colonizer. The way we represent history tends to be the same, in which minoritized persons are represented as weak, and hapless. If you think about American slavery, right? Slaves were just the kind way to represent them is to say they were helpless and poor slaves, right? And the kind way to represent indigenous persons is to say we brought them all of these wonderful things that they never would have had before, and they were so appreciative of it. We're about to go into American Thanksgiving right now, and don't get me started on the ridiculousness of this holiday. But so I think it's also not just who gets ignored in the construct, but how do people get represented in the construct? And what gets ignored there. I love examples around, for example, for me, what we call language arts, right? Around the world, we call it English language arts here, or reading. And how we define one's ability to write or one's ability to speak is often defined, the construct is defined as they can write if they can write in what we refer to as standard edited American English. Another term for that April Baker Bell refers to it as white mainstream English. So that's how we define the construct of being able to write. Can you write in standard edited American English? So what gets ignored there? African American vernacular English or Black English gets completely ignored. In fact, it's by how the construct is defined, it's deemed illegitimate, even though this linguistic system has rules that if you break, you look stupid, right? But we don't acknowledge that this system has rules, even though linguists tell us that all of these systems are equally complex and inherently on the face, not one is better than the other. But we've decided that the one that represents whiteness is in fact better. And so that's how we define our constructs, and that's how we define our rubrics moving forward, as this is what it looks like. And if you think about even within math, all of our algorithmic thinking, all of the ways in which we move through math problems relies on the Greeks and gives credit to the Greeks, as if Africans and Southeast Asians weren't doing it long before that Greek dude Pythagorean ever sashayed over there to steal it away, right? But we say there's one approach to do this, right? And we define the construct that way. And if the kid doesn't think that way, that mathematical way, so that they can take their assessment defined by that construct, then we say they don't know how to do math. So there are just so many examples of how we from the beginning define our constructs to be very narrow, and refuse to even think that it could be more expansive, that reading looks different depending on the community you're in, that the way you do math looks different depending on the community you're in. And let's not even get into psychosocial outcomes, these what we call socio-emotional learning outcomes. Because for the love of God, if we have defined that through the lens of whiteness for so long to the point that it has just gotten ridiculous, there is no reason to believe that for something like depression, that depression would look the same in a middle-class white woman as it would look in a poor Black woman. But all of our depression scales, that underlying construct is based on middle-class white women, right? What self-regulation looks like in young children. We define it by what is valued in white communities. How are you supposed to behave at a white person's house? That's how we've defined the construct of self-regulation, with no regard for what it might look like in a Black household or a Hispanic household in the US. So all of these are, I feel like, examples of how we have narrowly defined these constructs, that we've tried to make them culture free. But really the culture we're elevating is whiteness. And then when people can't perform based on that construct, we label them as deficient.
Tests are supposed to help make society more meritocratic and to reward educational achievements. They should predict who goes on to do well in university. Professor Randy Bennett from Educational Testing Service, the organisation responsible for running the American GREs, has recently developed some principles for designing more socio-culturally responsive assessment design.
Yeah, so I've suggested a way that might lead to fairer assessments in terms of a theory that I call socioculturally responsive assessment, or SCRA. And you can think of SCRA as one of a number of proposals that intend to account for differences in examining background, interests, and identity. And there have been many proposals to do so that go back at least 30 years. The early ones proposed principally by scholars of color like Ed Gordon, Stafford Hood, Carol Lee, and many others. And more recently, a set of new proposals by me, by Jennifer Randall, by my colleague at ETS, Michael Walker, and others. And these proposals tend to have a singular idea in common, and that is to try to design assessment for the background, interest, identity and prior knowledge of individuals and the context from which they come. So the idea runs against the grain of standardization, more toward the idea of personalization. And in SCRA in particular, I suggest 5 design principles, which are the building blocks for the theory. The design principles are not original. They come from various literatures. The first principle is to present problem situations that connect to and indeed value examinee experience, culture, and identity. And the idea there is to allow students to better show what they know and can do, because familiar contexts are going to be more likely to activate their prior knowledge than will be foreign ones. Those familiar contexts will also work to communicate respect for different identities in ways that help sustain those identities, as well as give other students an understanding of the cultures that their classmates bring. Finally, that kind of presentation of problems that relate to various cultures might also begin to broaden the content and processes valued by the school beyond the westernized subset that we currently privilege. A second principle is to allow for multiple forms of representation and expression in problem stimuli and in responses, because some forms may be more common to the ways of knowing and interactional patterns found in particular communities. This principle has long been practiced with respect to examinees with exceptionalities. So, for example, we offer to examinees with exceptionalities, those with visual impairments, for example, the option to take the test in Braille, to take the test in large type, to take the test as orally read. Up to them to choose, because they may be more or less comfortable with one or another form of representation and response. Third, promote instruction for deeper learning through assessment design. The development of conceptual understanding is critical to learning in a domain. And assessment design can influence what it is that teachers and learners do. That is, encourage students and teachers to pay attention to conceptual understanding, which kids from underfunded schools too often miss, because their teachers are not as well prepared and as highly qualified as teachers in better funded schools, and because those underfunded schools often have curricular resources that are less oriented toward developing conceptual understanding, for example, science labs. The fourth principle is to adapt the assessment to student characteristics. Standardized tests have long been based on the premise of standardization, that all students should receive the same content in the same format under the same conditions. And that premise is foundational for comparability of scores and fairness to individuals. However, variation in testing conditions and format content has occurred for decades in all kinds of tests, with scores still being considered comparable enough for the intended purposes. And there are many examples. Accommodations and modifications for those with exceptionalities would be one. Assessment in native language would be second, which is common in our state assessments in the U.S. and in international assessments like PISA, of course. Variations according to prior knowledge and interest, which is found when we offer problem choice, which we do in some assessments, that is, give the student the choice among different essay prompts. Variation occurs when we allow adaptation to prior knowledge, interest, and identity, which we do in some assessments where we give students the agency to design the problem. That occurs in several advanced placement assessments. And finally, it occurs all throughout high-stakes testing via choice of test location. Today, with respect to graduate and professional admissions tests and also a number of professional licensure tests, it's possible to take the test at home. And The scores of those tests taken at home are considered comparable to those taken in the test center. The existence of so many examples of adaptation coupled with the idea that examinees are highly diverse, both across groups and within groups, leads to the idea that tests might be personalized. And one might envision multiple ways for that to happen. A very small step in that direction is to create a bespoke assessment for each group of interest, and precedent for that exists with respect to accommodations and modifications and with respect to native language. A second approach is to try to personalize more deeply, and that deep personalization can be attempted in at least two ways. One way is via machine, which in the era of ChatGPT and AI seems very plausible. But that would require knowing what variables to adapt upon. That is, should it be interest? Should it be identity? Should it be prior knowledge? What else? How to measure each of those variables meaningfully, how those measured variables behaved conjointly, because they won't behave conjointly in the same way that they behave individually. And finally, what to do with that conjoint behavior. That is, how do you adapt content, format, and other aspects of the assessment once you know that conjoint behavior.
Professor Bennett mentioned different groups of learners that we often consider in terms of fairness, such as those with English as a second language or those with special educational needs. Dr. Paula Lehane at Dublin City University has conducted research on the assessment experiences of children with special educational needs. She argues that a lot can be done to adapt assessment practices to allow children to demonstrate what they know without necessarily distorting the construct of interest.
I suppose it's always important to remember that when we use the term special educational needs, and I think it's SEND in the UK, that is such a broad umbrella, and that people's experiences will vary according to their time, to age, to maybe their specific needs at any given time. So I suppose I'd always have that caveat that a general sort of statement may not apply to everyone. But I think one of the big things in terms of assessment is that idea that assessment may make it very difficult for a wide range of learners to actually demonstrate what they know, and that we don't empower them enough, individuals enough, to demonstrate the breadth of learning. Because oftentimes, I don't know, do we use assessments that capture the degree to which learners progress over time? And I'm not sure if we have assessment practices or procedures or tools in place to capture that progress, and acknowledging that progress happens at different rates, at different stages, that we have a vague idea, but in terms of content or domain progression, I don't know, do we have those tools? And that means it can be really frustrating for learners who know that they've made such great strides in maybe another domain that it might not be reflected in maybe a score that they get or a grade. So I think that's one thing I would always bear in mind, that maybe our assessments aren't kind of granular enough to capture that progression. And I'd know that from my own experience as a teacher. And I suppose the other thing to kind of take into consideration is that a lot of our assessment systems can have huge barriers, and that to overcome those barriers, to get access to supports, we often have to rely on a deficit model. Oh, you didn't meet, you fell below this percentile in word reading, you are now allowed access to a scribe. And that kind of really aligns with the medical model of disability, where the problem, in inverted commas, is within the individual to be fixed, rather than the system at a wider level or as a whole. So having to engage in those practices, can have a massive negative impact on learner self-identity, learner self-esteem. So I think they'd be two things I'd always take into mind, but even acknowledging that other people may be very happy with the assessment processes we have in play. Is that idea, it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach, but it might be more appropriate to always acknowledge, well, is there something I can do here? What can I change in the classroom if I can't necessarily change the system? Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in what can be done to make assessments fairer for all learners, in particular those who may have specific or special educational needs, so that it's more inclusive. I think going back to the idea that first thing we should try to identify as teachers, as educators, is the purpose. So what inferences am I trying to draw? And Black and William talk about this really, really effectively, that assessment is a procedure for making inferences. It's not just the endpoint that comes out. What can you learn about the learner? What are you trying to learn about the learner and why? And by kind of identifying the purpose first, then you can have a better match with the assessment approach. I think the second thing that would be really, really powerful, particularly for learners who are neurodivergent, who are autistic, dyslexic, is adopting a strengths-based approach and really trying to clarify what do they know already, rather than adopting a deficit approach of going, they don't know this, they don't know this, they don't know this, because that's actually not helpful in the teaching and learning process. I think it was Daniel Ausubel said that one of the single greatest thing for principles that we know from cognitive psychology is the impact of prior knowledge. So if we know what learners know, if we can identify what skills, that's the point where if we can assess that, identify that, we can build better plans for learning, rather than saying they don't know this, they don't know this. Well, what do they know? And have that as the strong foundation, because it's through effective assessment that the starting point for learning can actually be established, and find that foundation so you can build the learner up. And I think the final part that I would say is that I think authentic assessment has huge potential to ensure that assessment for all learners is meaningful and useful for them. And I think it was Gullikers and Kirshner a good few years ago kind of identified the different things that can be considered in developing authentic, meaningful assessments that align with the real world skill. Things like, what can you do to the task? What physical context should it come into play? The social context. And if we think about that, well, we can begin to examine what scaffolds can actually be left in for learners in this assessment process, or what scaffolds would need to be taken away to hold the construct or the standards steady. So if we think about, well, what actually is available, what scaffolds can still be made available to the learner to demonstrate their skills, and if I can see that, maybe I can move on to another sort of approach. And again, thinking about what is the final result or assessment form that we could take out. So I think there's some of the big ideas that can help support and enhance fairness in the assessment process for learners with special educational needs. Thinking about authenticity, and in thinking about authenticity, what modifications can be authentically made to a task, the timing and the conditions. There's a woman online called Anne Sullivan who does phonics for SEN, and her assessment approaches are really, really interesting. She works with learners who might be minimally speaking, who may not yet be using language, but who might use gestures or gestural approaches for communication. And she adapts her assessment and her teaching approaches using switches and buttons to understand what can the learner recognise, what sounds the learner can blend, etc. And she has some really nice videos demonstrating how, by focusing on what she's actually interested in, whether or not the learner knows the sound, and by modifying how that can be communicated using buttons and switches, that she can still assess their knowledge of phonics.
So there are some interesting possibilities for accommodations that can be made to assessments which would make them more accessible and therefore a fairer reflection of achievements. Other hugely challenging sources of unfairness to assessments internationally are cheating, corruption, and malpractice. In fact, this is often the first thing that comes to mind for people when thinking about fairness in assessment. Dr. Prince Agwu from the Universities of Nigeria and Dundee has been conducting research on so-called miracle exam centres, which, as the name implied, had been producing very high assessment outcomes. Ways in which people can cheat have been investigated by Dr. Agwu, such as having someone else sit the exam for you or helping you in the exam. Sometimes invigilators were involved in the corruption, and the rural nature of some schools made it difficult to monitor what was going on.
First, you now see that, like I said, you have some of these centers charging over 100% of the actually approved fees, for these exams. What that tells you is that the poor can't afford it. That's what it tells you. And then you now have somebody who is very brilliant, a child who is very brilliant, and because because he or she comes from a poor family, and obviously can't afford paying the high fees needed by these miracle examination centers. What that means is that this child is going to be competing against people he or she is better off than, but then who may edge him or her out by using devious means. So it creates an unfair system, especially when we now need to rely on these results to make decisions. We rely on these results to make decisions. We should get into tertiary school. We should get a job, and so you now have somebody who used a devious means to get all A's, and then this very brilliant child couldn't get all A's, but then him or her is being rated below in terms of what we can see. It's been rated below, especially when placed side by side the fellow who had used the miracle examination centers to cheat through, to get very excellent results. So it shows how poor people, brilliant people, somewhat have their chances diminished, because you now have the chances of those who can afford to go to the miracle examination centers elevated, even when they are not as brilliant as these other guys. Again, you have people who are moral, not really people who are moral being placed in a position where they need to unfairly compete, with those who have used the devious process and means, to get good grades, in these examinations. So you now see that the miracle examination centers somewhat create a kind of assessment inequities, so where those who can't afford, to use such a system, those who are morally conscious enough not to use such systems, those who are brilliant enough and believe in their brilliance and saying we wouldn't use such system.
These difficulties are, of course, not only a feature of assessment in Nigeria. Globally, wherever assessments are high stakes, there's evidence of cheating by pupils, by teachers, and by school leaders. Dr. Agwu's research, though, is highly innovative and compelling as it documents and explains the phenomenon. The research was conducted at great personal risk. To know whether assessments are fair, we need to analyse the results by subgroup and to interpret those findings in relation to what we were trying to assess, the construct of interest. Often, these analyses take into account how the learners have performed on other tests or questions. This leaves us with the problem of whether the construct itself and how it's developed is questionable, though. which most of the experts in this video have spoken about. In her publications, Professor Randall argues that we should design assessments from an ethnic minority group's perspective to experience what kind of effects that would have. Of course, the logic of educational assessment is a meritocratic society in which people are rewarded for their knowledge, understanding and skills, and not for who they know or what family they were born into. However, we also know that socioeconomic status affords people a lot of educational and other advantages, which mean that there's a large association between socioeconomic status and assessment results. For example, Professor Steve Strand from Oxford University found the correlation between socioeconomic status and GCSE examinations taken at age 16 to be 0.45, which is a high association in the social sciences. This is why academics have written about assessment reinforcing social divisions rather than disrupting them and producing meritocracies. Fairness in assessment is multidimensional. In trying to be fair to one group, we might be unfair to another. This is why it's so important to consider what construct is being assessed and therefore what scope there is for approaching this in different ways. Using different assessment formats raises problems for ensuring the comparability of standards. However, not all assessments are high stakes, so it's not always crucial to have standards at exactly the same level. In classroom formative assessments, for example, this might not be so important. With the increasing demands for inclusivity in education and in society more broadly, there are likely to be more calls for flexibility so that different learners' needs can be taken into account. Just how far you're able to flex your assessments will depend upon the purpose of the assessment, the stakes attached, and the construct of interest. We hope you found this video interesting. If you're interested in watching more of our films, you can find them on our website at the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment. The link is here. We hope you find them helpful.